Welcome to the first War on the Rocks Google Hangout, first video podcast. We're going to be talking about the split between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS. We have a really great slate of speakers for you here. We have Will McCants from the Brookings Institution. He's the director of the U.S. and the Islamic World program. We have Shiraz, Maher of the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation and Political Violence in London. We have J.M. Berger, our social media maven from IntelWire. We got Clint Watts of FPRI, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We got Brian Fishman of the New America Foundation. Thanks everyone for joining us. This should be fun. And we actually had a little contest earlier of who could have the most pretentious background, and I think I actually won. I don't know if anyone disagrees. This is different from most War on the Rocks podcasts because we don't have any alcohol because we're all at our jobs, or we're not showing that we have any alcohol. Brian's in Silicon Valley, so I don't know if standards might be a little different there. But I'm actually want to start with Will and Brian. I want to go back to Iraq because I feel like that's where you really understand this big split in the jihadist movement and where its origins are, and both theologically and organizationally. So Will, Brian, you guys want to take it from here and talk about this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us, Ryan. Brian, if it's okay, I'll go first. If you go back to the early days of the civil war in Iraq, there was a difference between Zarqawi and Zawahiri over the direction Al-Qaeda should take. And Zarqawi seemed to be pushing fairly strongly for the early establishment of an Islamic State, and Zawahiri wrote him a letter. One of the things Zawahiri cautioned him against is rushing into establishing that kind of state until they had created a broad front of like-minded actors and even people that weren't terribly conservative in their religious views. And Zawahiri warned Zarqawi if they didn't create that broad front, that any sort of Islamic State that they might set up would be imperiled. Zarqawi was killed soon after. His followers and Al-Qaeda in Iraq created that state. We don't know a lot about how Al-Qaeda, the leadership, reacted to it. It seems that there may have been some difference of opinion among them. Some of them favoring the early establishment, others like Zawahiri against it. It caused a big division in the global jihadi community. Some were for it, many were against it. They felt that the establishment of that state had been premature. One of the reasons they were against it was because the state didn't really control much territory at the time. And the other reason they were against it is because they didn't like the idea of calling it a state. But the word was carefully chosen by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's an Arabic word, dawla, which is the modern term used for state, but is also, interestingly, the name for one of the early Islamic caliphates. The Abbasid Caliphate was called the Dawla Abbasiyya. And so it has that kind of ambiguity to it that makes it useful in jihadist circles, because on the one hand you can claim some sort of discrete territory, first Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then Al-Qaeda in Iraq and greater Syria, but it also has pretensions to be the global Islamic Caliphate. And I think as events play out on the ground in Syria and in the region, we're seeing it slide more and more towards the latter view, as some sort of proto-caliphate and not something that's just going to be confined to the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really a good review. The one thing that I think is interesting about that period, as the Islamic State was being developed, is that if you look at Zawahiri's eulogy for Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, just after he was killed, he actually uses the word dawla and refers to sort of the development of an Islamic State there. And so, I wonder whether he was thinking, maybe it's time, now that Zarqawi is dead, who is obviously someone that the central leadership of Al-Qaeda never trusted very much, that it was time to sort of move forward and build an institution around which other organizations in Iraq could rally. But what's interesting about this is, wherever the sort of the core vision for declaring the state came from, I think that what we see today in ISIS that is really a direct descendant of the ISI and its declaration, and really before that, Zarqawi's perception of how to organize jihadism in Iraq, is around a couple of key ideological ideas where he really diverged from much of the jihadist tradition and angered not only central leadership in Al-Qaeda, but many of the senior religious scholars. And there's two key ideas that I think you see today. One was Zarqawi argued that authority for the primary authorities within the jihadi movement were not sort of organizational leaders and not ideologues. They were battlefield commanders, and it was proximity to jihad, because violent jihad was the purest form of worship according to Zarqawi. Therefore, proximity and participation gives you moral and political authority, and that to me was certainly indicated in a lot of Zarqawi's behavior, but also I think helps frame an understanding of why ISIS today has felt so comfortable rejecting Al-Qaeda's leadership. They justify themselves based on their proximity and the sort of legacy of these senior leaders in Pakistan, because they're distant from the battlefield, doesn't really matter. Pakistan, or even in places like Saudi or Yemen or Kuwait, where there are ideological leaders that are providing some context for what's happening. And the other thing that Zarqawi argued very strongly, that certainly isn't unique in the jihadi community, but that I think is very important, is that he felt, again, that you didn't need to be a religious scholar in order to declare someone kafir, to declare them a non-Muslim, right? And he felt that purity within a movement was really key. And this goes back to what Will was saying, where Zawahiri was arguing for a broader coalition of folks to build an Islamic State. Zarqawi, at the end of the day, was a purist. And what we see in ISIS today is this focus on purity, and at the same time, a federalization of the ability to determine what purity means. And so that both helps us understand why ISIS is so distant from, even organizations that have similar kinds of aims, like Jabhat al-Nusra. But those organizations are more willing to collaborate with other groups. But it also, I think, points to a potential failing in ISIS over the long run, which is that the institution itself, as it grows, may fracture. And that, to me, is one of the more interesting questions going forward. I sort of would have expected that to happen more than it has, to be perfectly honest. ISIS has held together better than I thought it would.
That's really interesting. And Shiraz, I know that you take a really close look at these sort of fissures within the larger jihadist movement, and the dynamic Brian was pointing to is pretty typical in terms of, if you look at the history of the jihadist movement. They have this sort of authority problem. They've claimed new sorts of authority out of step with the sort of Islamic traditions, and they're faced with the same sort of authority problems within their own ranks. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, to build on then sort of what Will and Brian were looking at in terms of where this is all going. If you look at the speech that was made by Adnani about a couple of weeks ago in relation to what's happening right now in Syria, it was really quite unprecedented. It was a stinging rebuke of Zawahiri directly. And they were saying a couple of things in that message which I think are very important to understand what ISIS is doing on the ground and how it sees itself, both in terms of operating on the ground and its relationship with Al-Qaeda central. So the first thing they said was, look, we are a state. You have to conceive of us and think of us as a state, not just an insurgent movement or a terrorist organization. We're a state. And in that context, your relationship, Zawahiri's relationship with us, needs to be on the same terms as it was in Afghanistan with the Taliban, with Mullah Omar. So he provides you with a space or a platform to operate from, and you give him bay'ah rather than we give you bay'ah, bay'ah being the oath of loyalty or allegiance in this case. So what they're really saying to Zawahiri is, look, you've misinterpreted what the terms of trade are supposed to be. We're the ones with the power. We're the ones who are in charge. And if you want to get on board, then you're getting on board with our agenda, not the other way around. And so I think that was very, very interesting from ISIS in terms of explaining just where it sits and just how it sees itself operating on both sides of the Syrian and Iraqi border right now. The other thing that they said, which was, I think, really interesting, was they said, again, to Al-Qaeda Central, to Zawahiri in particular, look, you're the reason that we haven't been able to attack Iraq attack Iran out of sort of loyalty and respect for you and your leadership previously. We held off attacking the Iranians. Now look what they're doing in Syria by proxy. They also blame him for what they see as a lost opportunity with the uprisings in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, saying that there should have been more of a jihadist input into the political turmoil that took place in those countries. So they blame him again for that. And what they're essentially saying is, look, we understand you're calling on us to withdraw from Iraq, from Syria, and just go back to Iraq, but we're not prepared to do that. We're not prepared to squander the opportunity that exists right here on our doorstep. As Brian was saying, proximity is very important to them, and they're saying, look, we're here. And they make that point repeatedly in the last statement. They're saying to Zawahiri, where are your men, where are your leaders, where are your generals? Frankly, what they're essentially saying is, you're not represented on the ground, therefore let us get on with it.
That's really interesting. And can we just take a step back maybe and talk really briefly about how ISIS evolved from ISI, just for our listeners out there who aren't as well versed in it as the rest of us?
Are you asking me that?
Sure, why not? Anyone that wants to chime in. It's a free-for-all.
So ISIS, of course, really took on the mantle here, having declared, as Brian was saying, an Islamic State originally in Iraq, and then we didn't hear too much of it for a while, and then with the opportunity, I think, to present themselves in Syria, have sought to take on a sort of extraterritorial sort of reach in terms of their agenda. They are holding fairly significant parts of the country there, and I think actually what Syria has done has re-energized them as a movement in total. It's allowed them to receive new input from new foreign fighters in particular that are providing manpower, and of course those guys now are not just fighting inside Syria but also in Iraq. So I think you're seeing the resurgence and the revival of this movement.
We just had someone comment already, a guy identifying himself as Ayman Jawad Al-Tamimi. He noted, sort of building what you were just saying, Shiraz, is that ISIS is claiming continuity with bin Laden, sort of doing this runaround Zarqawi, and named a street after him in Raqqa. So everyone else that's listening that wants to keep commenting, please do. And there'll be a Q&A later on. JM, how's this played out on sort of social media?
Well, what you can see when you're sort of looking at how ISIS messaging plays over social media, first you have to filter out a lot of ISIS's social media strategies. So they've been extraordinarily effective at organizing their efforts and introducing noise into the system online. So if you just do straight up kind of look at what ISIS puts out and how many retweets they get and how many people tweet their hashtags, it looks like they're crushing everybody else, but in fact there's a lot of not dirty tricks, but social media strategies similar to what a marketing company might do. They're very effective on that. So when you sort past some of that, what I'm seeing is that ISIS is making pretty significant inroads, but what they're doing is kind of whittling away at the core support for Al-Qaeda proper. So instead of winning over whole organizations, with a couple of exceptions, and I'll mention that in a minute, what they're doing is they're siphoning people out of existing organizations without converting whole organizations to their cause. So from my perspective, I think that's one of the better scenarios for us, because they're essentially making Al-Qaeda weaker, and they're not making themselves as strong as they would like to be. Now, within that, there certainly are signs that ISIS could do better. They have support in Yemen. They have support in Afghanistan. They have support within the core kind of Al-Qaeda activists online in the forums. They've had some prominent defections here and there from those kinds of groups. And I also think that based on what I'm seeing, and Aaron Zellin wrote something about this recently, but Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia and Ansar al-Sharia in Libya both look to be closely aligned with ISIS, and it's to the point that I'm really not totally sure why they haven't made a kind of a public pledge, unless they just want to keep their autonomy. But there's clearly a lot of overlap going on in those networks. So I mean, if push comes to shove and you start racking up the organizations against each other, those two probably go in ISIS's column.
Hmm. And Clint, you've had this really great series over at the FPRI blog on sort of smarter counterterrorism, and one of the things you've talked about is how this sort of split is going to affect U.S. counterterrorism policy, or how it could. And you made some really interesting recommendations. I thought you might want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, my big thing is that there's only two poles in the debate on counterterrorism. Either we got to go root out every jihadi on the planet and remove the ideology entirely from the globe, or there's no reason to do counterterrorism anymore. We should all just sit back in the United States and it'll all go away. And the answer, I think, is really somewhere in the middle. And a big component of that is maintaining our posture and our intelligence capabilities moving forward, which is very unpopular to say in the post-Snowden era, because as we know, the U.S. government just sits around and listens to this call and all phone calls on the planet all day. But the reality of the situation is, if we want to know when groups like ISIS are going to become a threat to the United States, when some other splinter, which there are many right now that could emerge, whether it's a Boko Haram problem or something out in the Sahel, or even back to Southeast Asia, which is also more active than it has been in quite some time, we got to make sure that we're keeping some sort of intelligence, surveillance, and working with partners, moving forward. And how can we work with partners too that don't undermine our values and really do us harm in the long run? Which is, if you look at the early years after 9/11, we were kind of taking any partner we could get, and now we kind of have to reevaluate how much benefit do we get, from each partner versus how much cost we get in terms of how they go about conducting counterterrorism operations. The other thing is focus on, old guard Al-Qaeda. So like ISIS is concerning, but I am somewhat wondering if ISIS is making a longer term strategy with regards to the U.S. If I were in ISIS right now, they're much more focused on building a state in Iraq and Syria. They're much more focused on sort of carving out their own operational space. Why would I go conduct an external operations attack against the U.S. and immediately draw intense counterterrorism scrutiny? I can wait. I should keep carving out my space, keep eroding old guard Al-Qaeda, and hit the U.S. later. I mean, that's and why do they want drones on their head right now? Meanwhile, if you look at the old guard Al-Qaeda guys, I think now more than any time in recent history, they really need to get a spectacular attack, because they really can't control or do much about the situation in Syria besides working through envoys, hoping that Nusra sort of behaves in the way that they would like it. But when you look at Al-Qaeda's levers and Shiraz and Brian, they were talking to a couple things. Why did Zarqawi, the whole Iraq situation, go the way it was? Well, Zarqawi believed that those in battle should be making decisions. I think we've seen that before throughout history, right? Those out in the fight want to make the decisions. They don't want to listen to some boss that's a million miles away that you never met. The other part is resources. This discussion hasn't really come up, but these guys in Iraq have been self-resourcing for a long time. So if the boss isn't controlling your resourcing, you can start to speak out and sort of push back on the boss when you want to. And the last thing is, Al-Qaeda really can't do anything about it. And up until recently, when they sort of pushed Nusra and some of the Islamic Front members, against ISIS, Al-Qaeda's got no real levers to try and control ISIS. So Baghdadi and his crew, they can kind of do whatever they want, and they know there's not going to be a ton of retribution because they're the guys on the ground. And also, by the way, they're the hottest ticket in town if you're a jihadist. So nothing looks worse than having in Zarqawi's days, he was motivating and inspiring more jihadis around the world than anybody. And then you got, Grandpa Zawahiri in the background, complaining and moaning about how he was conducting operations. So if you look at it over the longer term, I think ISIS is in, a position of strength. And for counterterrorism, if I were the U.S., I would really go after Nusra and those Al-Qaeda LNOs, liaisons that are out within the Islamic Front. Continue to squeeze them. They're going to stay focused on external attacks right now. ISIS, I think you got a little bit of time over the horizon. They'll all want to attack the U.S. in the long run, so you got to remain vigilant.
What do the rest of you think about all that? What are the reactions there in terms of Al-Qaeda Central having more incentives now than ever to launch an external attack, focusing counterterrorism on Nusra in Syria? Let's get some reactions.
Well, I think that in addition to Al-Qaeda having more incentive to conduct an attack, they've also got a problem with operational security because Zawahiri is now coming out with a statement every 2 weeks trying to get the situation under control, and every time he sticks his head out, he's inviting a drone to come on his head. And what's interesting to me, kind of when we think about the counterterrorism approach to this, is if you look at the players we have and you look at where our priority should be, who do you take out that would start the dominoes falling to really cause the Al-Qaeda Central alliance to crumble? You know, for instance, if you took out Ruhaishi in Yemen.
Yemen.
Yeah. I mean, take him out, what happens to this then?
Clint, do you want to? It seems like a better time than ever to talk about your T-shirt, Clint.
Yeah. Support our unmanned drones. Yeah.
Where'd you get that?
One of those websites. I can't remember. One of those, smarmy college T-shirt websites. But yeah, I think Jam hit it right on the head. And when you look at the strength of the old guard Al-Qaeda network, it resides in Yemen right now, in my opinion. Zawahiri's relevancy, if he can't actually get a big operation going, continues to get less, and the one lever he has to do that is his relationship with AQAP in Yemen. So from a big global Al-Qaeda perspective, we kind of drift on and off Yemen based on headlines. So last week was Boko Haram, and 2 weeks before that was Yemen. But the constant is that AQAP in Yemen has the nexus, the capability, the intent to do external operations. And I think that's something that the U.S. is going to have to be worried about for the foreseeable future. And I think it's evidenced by the big counterterrorism operation that was there a couple 3 weeks ago.
But Clint, let me challenge that a little bit. I mean, I think because I think you're right. I mean, to the extent that Al-Qaeda Central, that network, has the ability to conduct operations externally, it's most likely in Yemen. I think that while I agree that Al-Qaeda Central has an impetus to attack the West, particularly right now, I don't think that that is a meaningful distinction from its usual desire to want to attack the West. And I think that more important is, do they have the capability to do so? If they do, it's likely in Yemen. But I'm wondering about Ruhaishi, right? I mean, Ruhaishi's relationship was primarily with Bin Laden.
He's a Bin Laden man. Yeah.
He's a Bin Laden dude, and he was a Bin Laden dude. At a time when a lot of Bin Laden dudes weren't very happy with Zawahiri and the Egyptians that were gaining influence in those networks. So if you're Ruhaishi, do we see AQAP? I mean, why would AQAP continue to throw its lot in with Al-Qaeda Central at this point, right? The fundraising networks, everything else is drifting towards ISIS. The recruitment networks, if you're Ruhaishi, do you make a break? And I pose that as a question.
I wonder the same thing. Go ahead, JM, because you've talked about that before.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at what Zawahiri has in terms of levers, as Clint was saying, I mean, most of it comes down to personal loyalty and oaths that have been sworn and are difficult to retract. So, I mean, Gilani, frankly, has every incentive to take Jabhat al-Nusra independent because, I mean, they're much more power, support, fundraising, manpower than Al-Qaeda Central does. And arguably AQAP does too. So, I mean, really, you've got these awkward oaths that are very difficult to break from a religious perspective. There's this credibility problem if you swear allegiance to somebody and then just take it back because it's not convenient anymore. And so if you take out Ruhaishi, if you take out Gilani, their second in commands are not bound by the same oaths. And what happens when those guys come up? Who's gonna go which direction? And I think that there's a really interesting question there. You could see them go to ISIS. You could see them decide to be independent. It's really hard to see how Zawahiri has any leverage except the power of these oaths and these personal connections.
So if those guys die, just let me ask a difficult question. If those guys are killed or Zawahiri is killed, right, and the oaths are broken, right, and these kinds of organizations then aligned with ISIS, are we actually in a worse counterterrorism position at that point?
Well, that's
right? Are we better off with these guys alive and this division existing?
Well, that's what when I talked about the dominoes. I mean, what I've been thinking, what I'd like to see or do or see somebody do is really kind of game out what these scenarios are and see who's you take out this guy and what's likely to happen. You take out this guy and what's likely to happen. What we don't want to see is Al-Qaeda Central completely collapse and replaced by ISIS. We want to see these groups eating each other alive for as long as possible. And I think that we really have to think about what our counterterrorism strategies are right now. I mean, if we have a shot at Zawahiri, we're going to take it, but is that going to ultimately lead to a better situation for us, or if you take out Zawahiri, is everybody just fall in line behind ISIS? It's a difficult question.
I want to turn to Shiraz, because Shiraz, you just took this really interesting trip to Turkey, to the Syria border, and you actually talked to a lot of not just smugglers, but I believe you talked to some Nusra people even. You talked to foreign fighters making their way into Syria. So you have this sort of unique perspective on this based on your recent trip. What's your reaction to all this? What are your thoughts?
I actually wanted to challenge what Clint was saying a little bit. I'm not entirely convinced right now Al-Qaeda Central is all that concerned about attacking the West. Part of what it's doing, I think, is it's sensing an opportunity right now in Syria. That's also explaining a lot of its frustration towards ISIS, that it can't control this beast inside a country that is hugely important to Muslims, but it's also really probably one of their best opportunities in quite some time to take territory, hold it, and to be able to begin to build the project. So just as in the same way, drones and various kinds of attention would be focused on ISIS if they were to send people out towards the West to do attacks here, it's the same for Al-Qaeda Central. And one of the things we've been overlooking, we've mentioned AQAP, we've mentioned Wahesi, and what we haven't talked so much about is the fact that there were documents, of course, found in Mali after the French went in there, which had come from AQAP, talking about how you build an insurgency, how you win human terrains, how you win the support of local populations. Now that, of course, didn't work so well in Mali. There's no evidence to suggest that those letters were sent over to Syria. But I think in some of the actions of Jabhat al-Nusra, you can see the outgrowth of those lessons. And by that I mean, if you look at the sort of popular episodes of brutality that have been meted out so far in Syria, they come from ISIS. So the implementation of the Hudud is coming from ISIS. The sort of control of Raqqa is the ISIS thing. But Jabhat al-Nusra has been adopting a sort of a softer, a more covert approach towards the people. Syrians themselves, and you were mentioning my trip, Ryan, when we talk to Syrians themselves, they by and large, are pretty positive about Jabhat al-Nusra. They feel warmly about it. They see it as a national movement. It's still overwhelmingly of Syrian composition. It is still largely on the side of the people, hasn't done things in quite the same way that ISIS has. So right now, actually, Jabhat al-Nusra, and by extension then AQ Central, have everything to play for in Syria.
It's really interesting. We actually had one of our, someone listening, Sasha Gordon, commented on the Raqqa is being silently slaughtered social media campaign against ISIS right now. Do you think that Nusra's behind that, or do you think that's more of a grassroots meme that's being pushed?
There are lots of people on the ground in Raqqa who are very upset about what's happening. Again, I met with a member of the Free Syrian Army who was originally from Raqqa in Antakya when we were out there. And the picture that a lot of Syrians give about what's happening in Raqqa right now is very, very distasteful. So, there's no reason to think it's anything other than a grassroots initiative.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the theology of all this a bit. I find the sort of theological arguments between ISIS and AQ very interesting. We touched on this earlier, but where do we stand, and where are the sort of big jihadi theologians, the Maqdisis of the world and others, where are they looking? What are they saying about this?
I don't think there's a lot of theological daylight between the two groups. It's really more about action in the field and what you're allowed to do as an insurgent. And I think Shiraz is right that Nusra is playing this much smarter than ISIS in terms of trying to win over popular support. When Nusra first appeared on the scene, and it was clear that a lot of it was staffed by ISI people from Iraq, a lot of us, me included, felt like, here is the Al-Qaeda element in Iraq that has learned the lessons of the insurgency in Iraq and is trying to play this smarter. And then as things developed and it became clear that the ISI emir didn't agree with the way that Nusra was playing it became much clearer then that you had folks who had taken the lesson from Iraq and those who hadn't, people I call unreconstructed Zarqawists. I mean, the kind of folks that are running ISIS today are not trying to win over hearts and minds in any way. And this goes to a larger question about strategy, too, and whether they would go against the United States or not. I mean, they are certainly adhering to a strategy, but whether it's a smart one and whether it's one that's designed to keep them in power for the long haul, I don't know. They could very well attempt an attack on the United States to try and burnish their bona fides vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda Central. And I remember writing to Clint and JM privately over email about a month ago, just speculating what ISIS would also do in the wider Arabian Peninsula, because I was thinking, look, if I were ISIS and I really wanted to make a splash, I've got all of these human resources, I've got a tremendous amount of capital, I control large swaths of territory. What would really make a splash in the region? Certainly somehow an attack on Israel, but that's hard to do. But looking around closer to home, Saudi Arabia is an extremely inviting target for ISIS, and they're not terribly worried about pissing off potential funders. And I don't think it's any accident that a week or two ago we get our first reports of an ISIS cell in Saudi Arabia. And I would not be surprised at all, even if ISIS attempts to send a convoy into Saudi. They are playing a much different game than Al-Qaeda is playing. They are very much trying to establish themselves as a real geographical entity, and it is firing the imagination of a lot of jihadi youth who are tired of playing the wait game or looking for this virtual caliphate. They are very excited at the opportunity to establish a real one on the ground, and that's the hope that ISIS is holding out to them right now.
That's great.
I would
Fine, you go ahead.
I mean, when we talk about ISIS, I did an analysis of some of the social media activity looking at ISIS versus al-Nusra, trying to filter out the noise that ISIS creates with its apps and its campaigns. And what you can see once you strip away some of that stuff is that the people who are engaged with ISIS are really engaged with ISIS. So, the core ISIS supporters, both in the region and outside the region, are extremely enthusiastic and extremely excited. They're really fired up in a way that Jabhat al-Nusra supporters don't seem to be. So, I mean, I think that's really true. They have, come up with a theme that resonates, and the question is whether they can sort of translate that into political and military advantages, and that's where I'm not so sure that they've succeeded yet, but they're certainly making a lot of progress.
But this is they're doing so much better than the ISI ever did in Iraq, right? I mean, ISIS today is a completely different animal, and Ryan knows this, but Doug Olivan and I have written something that'll come out more on the rocks at some point here. That basically says this state is real. They de facto control a big swath of territory in ways that we haven't seen by a jihadi organization, since the Taliban fall in Afghanistan, right? I mean, the ISI never controlled territory with the impunity that ISIS does today, and never had the military capability to hold and defend ground the way ISIS does today.
Don't you think that's because the U.S. isn't there, Brian, for the most part?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. But I also think that they, the other part is that they've been able to engage in small unit combat and survive, which is because, as good as Hezbollah is and the Syrian army is, they're not as good as, the U.S. military, the U.S. army, right? So you've got guys that have had the ability, I think, to build up some lessons, and you've got real leaders now. They've also been able to incorporate all of these foreign fighters. I really want to hear from Shiraz on whether, what the impact of this discord, has had on recruits going to Nusra versus ISIS. But they're able to take advantage of those folks in ways that ISI never was. And I think we're in this position now where, this organization has to be treated as something very, very different than any other jihadi organization we've seen since the fall of the Taliban, because of its ability to control territory. And that may be thinner than it appears, but frankly, it surprises me precisely because they haven't been as forward-thinking as Nusra about engaging the population, that they've gotten as far as they have. And so it seems to me that there is, maybe it's still just brute force and brutal control, but there's, whatever they're doing, it's stickier than I thought it would be. And I agree with Will that they're going to look to the region. I would worry most about Jordan first, which is kind of the obvious choice. But I think that Will's suggestion about Saudi Arabia is a really interesting one, and especially in light of the news about an ISIS cell in Saudi.
Shiraz, you want to comment on the whole foreign fighter thing and how it's affecting their choices?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the largest number of foreign fighters continue to go towards ISIS, and there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, on the one hand, in some senses, the barriers to entry are just that much lower with ISIS. They're not particularly selective. They're quite happy to receive recruits. They want more recruits, and they'll continue to take people as they arrive. Other groups that we've been looking at on the ground in Syria, with regards to foreign fighters at least, they want you to be vouched in. There's a process of vetting, and you are capable of failing it. They will turn people away. They will want only certain sort of people to come into their organizations. As I say, ISIS is very happy to take in a large number of people, so that obviously gives them a distinct advantage. I think one of the things that's been really interesting to me in that context, Jay and Berger was sort of talking about it a little bit insofar as the online community that sits around ISIS on social media is incredibly partisan. It is very vocal in its support for ISIS. But what makes this so interesting is that the sort of hierarchy, the sort of traditional ideological leadership of the global jihad, so it's not just Zawahiri, but people like Maqdisi, Muhaysini, Abu Qatada, have all come out and condemned ISIS and told ISIS to rein itself in. And despite all of that, ISIS continues, and none of those messages seem to resonate at all with these people who are supporting ISIS or with the people who are lending it sort of moral and intellectual succor on social media. That, for me, I think is something quite unprecedented.
Well, there's two questions I'd like to throw out for the group. One is the supposed, we hear whispers of relationships between ISIS and the Assad regime. Now, on one extreme of that argument, there are accusations leveled that Assad and ISIS have a relationship, and they're using each other, and Assad is using ISIS to discredit the revolution and the rebel forces and keep them divided. The sort of more moderate version of that position is Assad let a lot of these jihadists out and spares their camps in the bombings because he knows keeping them strong enough keeps the rebels weak enough. So first, I'll throw that out there and get your reactions. Not all at once now.
I'll start. So, going back to some of the work that we did when I was at West Point with the Sinjar records, one of the things that we saw about foreign fighters that were entering Iraq with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISI was that there were different kinds of smuggling networks moving folks through Syria into Iraq. And while we haven't been able to sort of, at least I haven't been able to draw, one-to-one connection between those networks and the various jihadi networks that have popped up in Syria, I think it is reasonable to suppose that they formed some of the kernels of these organizations that are operating in Syria today. What's interesting about this is that there is some evidence that the Syrian government favored some of those smuggling networks during the Iraq, the core of the Iraq war, while cracking down on others. So the idea that Assad and his intelligence services would have some relationships with networks that could create jihadi organizations makes sense. That said, I think that there's a lot of wishful thinking here on behalf of supporters of the Syrian rebellion that they can tie Assad directly to ISIS. And I understand that, but I think, I very much wish that those supporters of the Syrian rebels would have been more critical of ISIS in its early days, because they tolerated that organization for way longer than they should have, because it was seen as effective militarily against the regime. And they should have seen this coming. And so while the idea that Assad would avoid certain ISIS targets because he knows that they create discord within the rebellion, I think makes sense. But that doesn't mean that there is active collaboration. And at the same time, I think many of the rebel groups only have themselves to blame, because they allowed this to fester and they never should have.
All right, anyone else? All right. Oh, Clint?
I just think there's, I mean, now you see it on the other side that ISIS is saying Nusra is working with Iran or something like that. And so anytime you get a long, protracted insurgency and war, you get all sorts of conspiracy theories in the background. I just have to imagine if I'm Assad right now, I'm not spending a whole lot of energy worrying about all these connections to, you know, and can I manipulate all these different groups? And you're just doing whatever you need to do to survive. So maybe, you know, there's light connections between one or the other, but I think that guy has got a lot on his mind, and they got a lot of things to worry about in terms of their relationship with Iran and the IRGC and Hezbollah and all these other things. You know, I don't know. I just don't think it's that significant. I think it's more the fact that ISIS is attracting a lot of support throughout the jihadi community, so they're continuing to grow strong, and they're not wasting energy, you know, in places that maybe Nusra, Islamic Front, FSA are. And if you're Assad, you go, hey, ISIS, you know, is farther out, you know, geographically to the east, but I got all these other guys, you know, biting up my ankles from Latakia all the way down to the Israeli border. I'm going to focus on those guys first. I mean, just militarily, that's what I would be thinking about.
All right, we have about 5 minutes. I unfortunately, this is our first Hangout, so you have to forgive me, didn't turn on the Q&A feature before the Hangout started, so I can't take Q&A from our audience of viewers, and I apologize for that. But
why are you censoring them, Ryan? Why are you censoring the populace?
Assad paid me off, so you know. No, but if you tweet your questions at us to War on the Rocks Twitter account at War on the Rocks, or post it on the event page, I'll address them. And while I give you a chance to do that, I just want to push back on Clint a little bit. I guess is, you know, you say focus on squeezing Nusra,
yep.
But if most of the foreign fighters from Western countries are headed to ISIS, and
right.
Our biggest concern is to protect the homeland, shouldn't we be most concerned about that?
Well, let's talk about where most of the foreign fighters are coming from. Most of them are not coming, you know, from the U.S. So whose homeland do you want to protect? I mean, there is the European connection, which we got to be worried about, and the trickle flow. The other thing is, like Thomas Heghammer says, is like we've convinced ourselves that every foreign fighter that comes out of every conflict is immediately going to turn and strap on a suicide vest, and that's probably not the case. You know, the numbers are probably smaller about how many are committed to doing an attack. And what nobody's talking about right now, this is actually my next post that comes out this week, is there's already foreign fighters that have come back home. This conflict's already drug on for 3 years, and we're acting like they all stay in Syria until the conflict ends, and then they're all going to leave like at one time. That's not the case. There are already some that are back home, and they're floating back home. And Britain, I mean, Shiraz can talk to this better than me. You know, Britain's dealing with how do we handle this situation legally, you know, in terms of citizenship and things for these folks that, you know, are cycling off the battlefield. And the other thing about objectives, you know, when you look at ISIS, you know, in general, they're about global jihad, but they're not talking about doing lots of external attacks, you know, at home. Whereas I am very confident that Nusra and those folks that are tied in with, you know, Al-Qaeda liaisons that are in the other Islamic Front, they're going to be looking at those guys with access back to the West, those foreign fighters they do pull in, and saying, hey, when you go back home, what would you think about, you know, the following scenario? So that's why I'm not saying I'm not worried about ISIS foreign fighters, but I think the Nusra Front and those old guard Al-Qaeda guys that are tied into that network are going to be much more capable about putting people into legitimate plots and you know, routing them towards legitimate targets that the West should be worried about.
All right, Shiraz, you want to plug ICSR's research on foreign fighters at all? You've been a big part of before we conclude.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that front, I mean, there have been 250 returnees to the UK alone since the start of the Syrian conflict. So I think Clint is absolutely right there. It's not something that we need to think about happening at the end of the conflict. It's a dynamic process. People go to Syria and people return from Syria on a constant basis. So it's something that the government has been looking at for a while. I actually think the government strategy is wrong in this context. They are using prerogative powers, so really bypassing Parliament altogether to strip people of their passports and to deny them citizenship. And what that's going to do is, I think that there is going to be a large class of people who will return to this country who will not pose any further threat. But obviously they'll need to be looked at and they'll need to be spoken to, and an assessment will need to be made as to what risks and threats they pose, but also just to help reintegrate them back into normal society because of what they've chosen to do. Now look, when you look at the Arab Afghans who were leaving Afghanistan at the end of the 1980s following the defeat of the Soviet Union, the first tranche of returnees found life very difficult. Rather than being treated as heroes, they were being sent to prison in Egypt and Saudi and Algeria and all these various countries. And so they had no choice. They were essentially made stateless themselves. And so they had to regroup. So they went to Sudan and then, of course, back to Afghanistan. And what you've done in that case is you've forced these guys to stay together perhaps longer than they would have done. And you've essentially disenfranchised them. So you've given them reason to try and find a new cause, a new purpose in life. And I think that's what we're going to end up doing in Syria, that there could be a whole class of people that could return and could be successfully reintegrated. But by keeping them focused there and keeping them all together, you're essentially putting them in a cauldron where they're going to continue to radicalize one another further, to seek out larger, more fantastical sort of end games and aims that they'll be striving to. And I think we may end up in some way at least contributing to the very problem we're seeking to solve here.
That's great. That's really interesting. That's a point that I hadn't heard yet. I just want to go real quick. Last comments. It's sort of become a grim parlor game. What would you do in Syria if you had one sentence or two sentences to tell the president how to handle Syria, and particularly in regards to the jihadist problem? Let's start with Will, and then go to Shiraz, and then Clint, and then we'll end with Brian. Then we'll wrap it up.
I guess if I were the administration, I would push to cut off the private money that's coming in from the Gulf that's going to some of the worst of the Salafi groups. I would press countries like Qatar, who are funding some of the worst of those Salafi groups. And I would encourage the administration to get serious about arming the Syrian rebels through a central mechanism.
All right, Shiraz?
I would agree with the world's last point there. I think the United States and European partners as well need to work with trusted rebels on the ground, and there are ways to look into that. But you were saying in a word, if I had the ear of the president, I'd say Syria now is about containment. That's what the problem is. We cannot anymore get in and unravel the jihadi problem. I think that boat sailed a long time ago. There was a chance at one stage to avert this, but we are in the situation we're in. Now the conflict really needs to be contained. We need to make sure it doesn't spill over. We've already talked about Saudi, Jordan, Israel, various potential for all of those countries to be attacked in one form or another. So it's about containment.
All right, Clint?
So Will and Shiraz already got two, so now I got to think of the third. Yeah, countering threat finance is huge. Longer run containment of the Syria issue. And then I'm much more about picking my battles. I think focus on curbing Nusra, because I think ISIS will curb itself over the long run. I don't see any population or any governments ultimately that are going to tolerate ISIS in the region. Whereas Nusra, as Shiraz pointed out, is playing a much smarter long game in that area, and they're also pushing up on the Israeli border. So if you don't deal with Nusra in terms of your plan, I think if you're not, I shouldn't say deal with it, I say prepare for it, the worst case scenarios.
All right, thanks for that. Brian?
I think there's a lot of smart stuff that has been said. I agree very much about the funding that gives ISIS the ability to be independent. I think that we should be supporting weapons to very well vetted Syrian militants on a small scale. I don't think we should expect that that's going to turn the tide in the war. The only thing that can do that is a united rebel front, and we're a long way from that. The one thing that I think that hasn't been mentioned is I think we need to try to figure out how we rebuild relationships with some of the tribal groups on the Iraqi side of the border that we had during the awakening. We need to invest in the Iraqi government as well, but that government is problematic for a variety of reasons. And I think we need to find a way to have stable relationships with some of the friends that we had, or at least allies is maybe a better, temporary allies that we had during the latter stages of the war in Iraq. Western Iraq is a safe haven as much as Eastern Syria at this point.
I think we should vote, Brian.
Oh,
Yeah, we need
should
more
have a big
purple fingers,
election.
Clint.
That's right.
All
Have a
problem.
big election.
all right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks you guys for being a part of this, our first War on the Rocks video podcast and Google Hangout. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll do this again on a different topic. And I promise to get the Q&A thing right. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for tuning in as well. Take care, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan.